Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hey, this is Ali Amagasu coming to you with the latest episode of Cloud Unfiltered. As always, I am joined by my co-host, Pete Johnson. Appears to be coming from the nerd lair in Upper Michigan. Is that correct? Or where are you today?
I am indeed in the underground nerd lair, where we're actually supposed to get a high of 60 tomorrow, and we might get some snow melt as opposed to the 3 feet of snow that's been piling up in my backyard and outside my driveway. So spring may actually be coming to Michigan here soon.
That's weird. It's coming to California the same week as well. This is our first week in the 70s. And I know that sounds like such California whining, but
yes, it does.
Honestly, this February was the first February since they have recorded temperatures that we didn't have one day in the 70s in Los Angeles. So we are rightfully put out.
Let me make this more important to the general masses. The construction at Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland has been delayed because of all the rain you guys have been having.
There you go. That's how real it is.
Yeah.
So I know we have been on a tear recently with some really interesting topics and some unusual guests. And I'm not putting you in that category, Joe. You may not be unusual, but today I'm happy to welcome Joe Duffy, the founder and CEO of Pulumi. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm not saying you're an unusual individual, but I'm saying that in having done a little bit of research about Pulumi, it's certainly not the kind of thing we speak about every day. So I'm very interested in hearing how it all works. For those of you who are tuning in right now and aren't familiar with Joe, the man has 27 patents. So watch the heck out. At least that's when I did my research you did. Who knows how many more you've bagged since then. Yeah. And Pulumi, to summarize, is a cloud native development platform. That's my understanding. That it's an open source project and a commercial service. You can expand on these things, Joe. And that it targets Kubernetes as a layer for multi-cloud app deployment. Am I close on that?
That's perfect. Right on the money.
Right on. Well, why don't you go ahead and expand and give us why did we need Pulumi? What does it do that's different than what else is out there right now?
Yeah, so I think I approached cloud development from a very different perspective than sort of a lot of folks that are in the cloud space today. You know, my background, I was at Microsoft for about 13 years before starting Pulumi about 2 years ago. The whole time I was there, I was in and around developer tools and technologies and platforms. You know, I worked on the .NET framework, the C# programming language. I worked on the Windows platform. So I think I approached everything from a software platform perspective. And I think if you look at the cloud, there's incredible capabilities in the cloud. And I think, you know, things like containers and serverless and Kubernetes as a platform that's very programmable really resonated with me. You know, you look at serverless programming, and it's sort of reminiscent of a lot of event-driven programming that we used to do, you know, with Visual Basic, and even today's, you know, Node.js programs are very event-driven. But what I found when I came to the space, and I was working a lot on, you know, I was putting together the project to take .NET open source and cross-platform, and part of the motivation there was actually collaboration with Red Hat and Docker to really make .NET a great first-class environment for Azure applications, because we found, you know, a lot of Azure is actually Linux based. It's not, you know, Windows. And so we found a lot of our customers were having to abandon the .NET platform when they went to the cloud. And as part of that, you know, experience, it was very jarring to me to go from a place, you know, thinking of developer productivity and tooling as a first class thing, you know, from programming languages, to now suddenly infrastructure is an afterthought. You know, it really harkens back to, if you look how do we get to where we are today, you look at the transition from, you know, lift and shift and VMs, where developers really didn't have to think about the cloud as part of their application development. They just kind of wrote code, handed it to their ops team. Their ops team did whatever they needed to configure it and put in a VM, and everybody was happy. Now the pace is just so much faster. The granularity of cloud resources is so much more fine-grained. It's much more part of the application's architecture. It's not an afterthought any longer. And what we found when we started, you know, Eric, my co-founder, and I, we really just sat down and started exploring the space. And what we found was this huge disconnect. It wasn't just technological, it was also cultural. You talk to a lot of teams where, you know, DevOps has come a long way in the last, you know, 15 years. Chef and Puppet have done great things to that community. Technologies like Terraform and even the cloud vendors themselves have really embraced this. But we still find when we talk to teams, we've got the ops team over here and the dev team over here. And people are clamoring for new ways of collaborating and breaking down some of those silos. And we really thought, hey, with Pulumi, we're going to bet on programming languages. We're going to bet on platforms like we know and love. We're not going to create another YAML sort of templating solution. We're going to think of this as a first-class software engineering principled approach and see where it takes us. And 2 years later, we've had a lot of success. It's really resonating with our user base, and now we're just sort of building from there. We have the foundation in place, and it's really been a very powerful initial set of maybe radical bets, but they've really paid off and struck a chord with people.
So what is it that Pulumi does then? I mean, you gave me great insight into what was driving you toward starting this, but what is it that Pulumi does, or is, I guess, for lack of a better description?
So I think of Pulumi is two things. One, it's open source, an open source SDK for doing infrastructure as code. And so this is a common thing, CloudFormation does this, Azure Resource Manager, Templates does this, in some sense Helm and Kubernetes YAML does this, and of course Terraform. But we've done it sort of differently. You can use programming languages you know and love, so you can use JavaScript, TypeScript, Go, Python. We've got on our roadmap, .NET, Java. And because you're using real languages, you can benefit from abstraction. You can build bigger things out of smaller things. You can use your existing package managers to share reusable components. So I can't tell you how many customers we work with that have the same 1,000 or 2,000 lines of boilerplate to set up an Amazon VPC network in AWS, or take your favorite example. We can create a package out of that, and now it's shareable, it's reusable, it's easy to, you don't have to copy and paste. So that's one part, the SDK, and that's all open source. The second part is a SaaS offering that was co-designed, so it goes hand in hand with the open source. And it's sort of the easiest way to operationalize continuous delivery of your infrastructure, rigorous deployments where you have full auditing history of who changed what and when, and we integrate with your source control provider, so you can actually go from, hey, on date X, somebody deployed some changes, you can see what the changes are, you can go back to GitHub and see the code as it was checked in. And so it's really a suite that allows the collaboration for developers and operators to actually go into production with solutions that use the Pulumi SDK.
That sounds amazing. Pete, does this raise some questions for you?
Yeah, it does. So let me try to restate that based on one of the container examples that you have on your website. So there's an example that you guys have where you're deploying Nginx to AWS Fargate. And if you want to be real strict about it, instead of using some kind of CloudFormation where you have to go learn the file format and all the intricacies of that, instead you show an example where you can deploy it in 3 lines of node code.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in the SaaS, so does that, I guess, so it sounds like, and correct me if I've got this wrong, that node code will run on your SaaS, translate that to whatever the set of either API calls or CloudFormation calls it needs to under the hood, and then it gives you some historical tracking and some of those other things you mentioned. How close am I to?
That's very close. And I think the key is, with the SaaS, what you're saying is exactly right. And the key thing is the SaaS helps you do that in a team environment. So you can actually, a lot of people are using it for sort of GitOps workflow where you're not manually doing deployments, but instead you're triggering those deployments, maybe based on a push of a branch to another branch. And another key thing that resonates with a lot of our customers is it works the same way regardless of which cloud you're going to. And so we actually have customers doing on-prem, hybrid, Kubernetes on-prem, Kubernetes hosted in EKS or AKS or GKE. And that workflow you describe is consistent regardless of where you're going.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that you've taken this idea of abstraction, and I mean these things are always cyclical. But you've moved it back into code and away from configuration, which is an interesting take, right? Because we've had for so many years the other way that, hey, you don't have to learn programming. Here's a config file that can do this all for you. But I guess what led to the decision to take that the other way and instead do it in code instead of what has become, this cumbersome set of different configuration formats and weird nesting and all that kind of stuff? It's
partially, I think, our background. My co-founder and I have, we've designed several programming languages in the past. We actually worked in Microsoft research on on a new operating system, a distributed operating system that had its own programming language. So we had a lot of experience building languages. But we actually started with, hey, let's do another templating solution. You see a lot of these solutions out there that are templating on top of YAML.
Yeah.
But that really just made it feel even ickier, right? It's, doing for loops in YAML, it feels like you're swimming upstream.
It does.
And it feels like you're kind of treating YAML like assembly language. And so if you draw the analogy of high-level programming languages, yes, assembly language is still there, and there's still the instruction byte code for your target processor. But these days, people program in C or JavaScript or Java, and they compile down to that target. And so we sort of thought of it in a similar sense. So, like, there is still configuration. It's actually a key important thing. We are still infrastructure as code. So you can still, when you're doing deployments, it's not the Wild West. You still see the diffs before you do the deployments. And it's really the marriage of infrastructure as code with programming languages, which I think makes it a little bit special. Because, you've got Bodo, right? Like the AWS Python SDK, and all the clouds have their own SDKs. You can go write programming, you program code if you want, but it's not reliable. It's not robust. If something fails, there's no sense of rollback. It's not auditable, so you don't know who changed what. And so that was the key difference, was the marriage of those two concepts.
Right. Now what impressed me about the abstractions, specifically with the serverless, and so this is where Ali's warning is coming true, is that you didn't just go for the compute part of serverless when you built these abstractions, but there's a table on your serverless page. So if you literally go to Pulumi/serverless, there's a nice table you have in there where you describe the different building blocks of serverless, and you describe them in very abstract terms in terms of object storage, data storage, timers, queues, topics, and so forth. And then what that maps to on the different public clouds. And I was impressed by that, because I've seen different abstractions, but they usually stop at the compute layer. What is it that led you to sort of take in the bigger picture for this as it relates to serverless?
Yeah, so across the entire stack, and this is true of containers as well, we've sort of layered the system. So it's kind of interesting. And you can sort of pick the layer at which you want to program. And it's similar to, say, file system APIs in Node.js or something. If you know you're targeting Win32, you can just code to the Win32 APIs. If you want a higher productivity thing, you can program to these higher level, nicer abstractions. But the way they work is they just layer on top. It's turtles all the way down, right? It's just code. And so because we use code, we can do the same thing. We can just build abstractions, and we can deliver abstractions that make sense at different, for different user types or, cohorts, if you will. So like, a DevOps engineer probably wants to program at the raw, low-level bits and bytes of everything. So we actually have the raw, low-level providers that everything bottoms out on, that gives you full-blown access to every single property, every single resource type in every cloud that you might want to go for. On top of that, we layer these productivity libraries so you don't always have to, repeat yourself. So that network example I gave is another. What you're referring to is this high-level layer that actually, we built that sort of for productivity for developers that really just want to get up and running as quickly as possible. And they just want to say, hey, every hour, fire a timer and run this piece of code. Or, hey, here's a queue. And anytime anybody inserts into the queue, just run this little function over here.
Right.
And what we find today is, like, you write your 20 lines of JavaScript that you want to run every time, every hour or what have you. But then you have to go write 1,000 lines of YAML to configure the CloudFormation templates or whatever it is. Right. So we really took those patterns and we said, hey, what are the most common patterns? And how do we just make that as little code, as easy to write as possible? And then we focus on maybe 10 to 12 of those patterns, and those are the ones that you're referring to. Now, the important thing is you can mix and match these. A lot of people will say, well, then you're just, that's just the lowest common denominator, so it's never going to be as powerful. But the key thing is you can choose to program at this level, that level, or the low level, and you can even mix them in the same program depending on what's appropriate.
Right. So, for example, like if you go a little bit further down the containers page, the initial containers example you have is that Nginx example that I mentioned earlier. But a little bit later, you've got a second example that, okay, if I use Pulumi to deploy the initial Nginx, but then I can still attach a Docker file to this to do like the file copy from, some shared drive that I have locally to like, to a www folder that's on my target container. So that's what so is that what you mean by kind of mixing and matching these, where I can still go to my native tools if I need to?
Absolutely. I think having answers along different points of the spectrum, I'm a big fan of Heroku, in App Engine and a lot of these PaaSes, but I think the place where PaaSes go wrong is they are opinionated, which works until it doesn't work. And then there's no way to pierce beneath that abstraction layer. And that's because typically these PaaSes are sort of special purpose. Because we're programming language, it's, like I said, the turtles all the way down thing, right? So like, if you know that there's a property deep down there that you want to get your hands on, we're not going to hide that from you.
Right.
And that spectrum is really the really powerful thing that's very different.
Now, what about the onboarding of this? So this works. I can see how this would work spectacularly if you're doing this greenfield, right? But let's say I already have, some kind of Terraform investment, or maybe I already have a bunch of Docker files. How do I onboard this from a brownfield perspective?
Almost every customer, not even almost, every customer we work with is dealing with a brownfield situation. That's definitely true. So we've gotten really good at having answers for all those different ones that you mentioned. Terraform, for example, we actually have full fidelity. We can actually leverage the Terraform provider ecosystem. So any Terraform program, we actually have a conversion tool that will convert it over to Pulumi. And it works, 97% of the code just works. And then there's a few places you have to fix up, but it really helps with that conversion.
Sure.
CloudFormation, ARM templates, Helm charts, Kubernetes YAML. We actually allow you to take these and deploy them as is through Plumie. So, if you just wanted to deploy an existing CloudFormation template, you can do that. What most customers do is they'll do that to start, and then they'll start peeling pieces out and converting
moving some of it over into code, because you have this notion of them running in conjunction. If you wanted to dip down to the details, you can just start with the details and try to move stuff up the stack.
Exactly. And
okay, nice.
Code, the other nice thing about code is you get IDEs, right? So you get an editor, whatever your favorite editor is, just works, and you get refactoring. So in this process you're mentioning, you've got now you've brought it all into code, and now it's a matter of refactoring. And you can even do things like, extract into class. Like a lot of these refactoring tools will help you actually create these abstractions. And now you're just like running full speed ahead. And Plumie works really well for the incremental updating. So anytime you make one of these refactorings, you just run Plumie up, and it's going to show you what changed before it makes those changes, and then we'll keep on with it. And so it's all incremental.
Interesting. Now, how does this get priced?
Yeah, so we have a few solutions, and we're actually working on launching a few changes to that shortly. Right now, we have a pretty great free tier. So when you download the open source, by default, and you can opt out of this if you don't want to, but by default, it will actually use our SaaS for deployments, for the state management, for concurrency control, and that's all free. And that's basically for individual usage. We have people using it in teams as well, but a lot of the collaboration features just aren't there. And so that's where what we call the team edition comes in. The team edition basically allows you to take any GitHub org, Atlassian org, GitLab org, and onboard them. And that we're doing a per user pricing. We're in the middle of transitioning from our old pricing model, but it's a pretty de minimis per user pricing and then we have the enterprise edition as well for people who need SAML or on-prem installations.
I was about to ask, how many different pricing models have you had since you started? Because that's like a litmus test for a startup, right? My father-in-law was a building inspector for many years, and he always used to tell me that there's no home improvement project worth doing that doesn't require at least 3 trips to the hardware store. So I think if you take that same analogy, right, there's no startup worth working for that hasn't changed its pricing model 3 times. So are you up to 3 yet, or is this just trial 2?
Well, this will be at least number 4 if you count the ones we didn't publish. But
there you go.
Yeah, I count that. I totally count that. You spent time on it and thought about it. So yeah, I completely count that.
I think the takeaway there is we definitely overthought it, and we overthought it for all the right reasons. but we definitely overthought it. And so the feedback was like, hey, the pricing, because we're charging per service basically, which accidentally penalized people that were doing microservices, and that was not our intent. We wanted to make it consumption pricing, because it's just easier. You know, the more you use, the more you pay for it, and you're seeing value, and so it makes sense. It's aligned, but per user, everybody just understands per user. It's so much easier to explain and project and budget for. So that's what we're switching to.
Okay.
Hey,
now,
Joe,
what about?
Oh,
no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask him if he could tell us what it looks like in the real world. Like, if you can give us a few case studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the interesting thing is we have a broad spectrum of customers, and that's why we're launching these pricing changes, because we want to cater to every point along that spectrum. I would say, we've got from, single DevOps engineers in a team of 10 that want to use Pulumi to just be rapidly improving, and they want to empower their developers to actually contribute to some of the infrastructure. So they're no longer the bottleneck. That's a common thing for us. In fact, we're launching some startup discount offers because we've got a few Y Combinator companies, a few Techstars companies, accelerators. We're starting to partner with some accelerators to go give presentations. And basically the idea there is like, you just started a company. Do you want to spend the next month bringing up your infrastructure, or would you rather do that in an afternoon in a way where you can empower your team to help? And so that's really resonating. Get a lot of people in between. I think the mid-market for us is sort of a sweet spot. These are the shop, maybe 20 to 50 person teams where, again, they have to deal with multiple clouds. They might have dev and DevOps, but then all the way up to Fortune 500 companies where, 1,000 person infrastructure team. We're working with a fairly large a couple of financial firms in New York, but one of them is they're basically, they just decided to go all in on Kubernetes, and they were already dealing with Azure and AWS deployments. And then you throw Kubernetes into the mix, and it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And they were like, hey, we're going to take a step back and really rethink how we're doing continuous delivery, but also infrastructure and application delivery across our entire organization. And Plumie resonated with them because technologies out there are specific to a cloud or specific to containers or serverless or this or that. So we're one of the few platforms out there that's really taken this broad view on the market.
Is there a vertical that you guys would cater to, or is it just happened that a couple of financial companies have gravitated toward your product?
Yeah, we debated going vertical to start, but we found, a lot of traction sort of across the board. So we decided, hey, to do the thing you're never supposed to do with a startup, just to build a horizontal platform. I think financial, I see a lot of people that are really cutting. It's funny, at Microsoft, programming languages, it was always the financial companies that were doing cool things with, functional programming and new programming languages. And I see a lot of early adoption of, Kubernetes and containers in the financial segment, but for sure we're seeing it across the board. We have German automobile manufacturer that's successfully using Pulumi for Kubernetes as well. What we're finding is Kubernetes isn't the sole reason to pick Pulumi, but it's often the sort of catalyst for people to really step back and rethink what they're doing in the cloud space.
Pete, I cut you off earlier as you were trying to ask the question.
I mean, Joe, what you just said makes complete sense, right? Because that learning curve is significant for some people. So really what you're doing is your product lowers that learning curve across multiple audiences. So the Kubernetes angle for that completely makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple of startup kind of culture questions to ask you that I hope you'll find a little bit fun here. So I'm looking at your About page. Can I assume that you do not employ a llama and instead employ a employee who's camera shy and instead would prefer their headshot be of a llama?
That is correct. And I've known, this is Cyrus. I've known Cyrus for probably over 10 years now. He actually worked in my group at Microsoft for some time. He worked at Google for some time. My entire time knowing him, he's always had a picture of a llama. He doesn't seem to have a llama obsession other than the fact that his photo is always a llama.
See, I thought you were going to say, and I've never met him. I don't know what he looks like. He could be that llama, and I don't know.
No, in fact, I saw him this morning, and he did not look like a llama.
Okay, so is this a pet llama? Is this like, Like, how did you go about selecting that specific llama to represent him on your headshot?
I don't know. I do know he's had several different llama photos over the last.
Okay, so that was going to be the next one. Was like, is this some long dead llama that is like living on in memory, or is this like I have a reasonable amount of llama questions, obviously.
Yeah,
but the other question,
have a family of llamas that I don't know about,
that, like lives in his backyard secretly. All right.
Yeah, I'm very curious.
I don't know. It's obviously unusual. So I had all these llama-based questions that came up as a result. But one of the fun things about working at a startup is coming up with the name and coming up with like the color scheme and so forth. So what's the history behind the name Pulumi, and what was that process like? Yeah,
so the name is actually sort of an honorary name for a friend of mine, and Eric, my co-founder. His name is Chris Broom. We worked with him for many years at Microsoft. He was at Google for a few years after that, and he was actually advising the startup. He sort of like inspired us to create a bunch of it. And unfortunately, he passed away at the very early. But his last name, it's kind of funny. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing because his last name is Broom, Brumme. But everybody mispronounced it as Broom. And so that was always a running joke. So Pulumi is actually Hawaiian for broom. It turns out he was actually from Hawaii as well. So he's a very dry humor kind of guy. So it's kind of a double joke there. But unfortunate history. It was also 6-letter name, and the domain name was available. So
yeah, well, that's half of it, right? Is what domain name and what Twitter handle can you get your hands on for free? But that you found a way to honor a friend that helped you start this to begin with. That's a really sweet story. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
That is a good story, which leads me to believe, to hope, that you've got a good story about how you got into tech. How'd you wind up walking down this path?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. So I guess I started programming when I was like 12, I guess. But I got into it because my friend's father worked at IBM, and he told me one day, hey, did you know you can create your own games if you just, learn how to write code? I'm like, all right, that's motivation enough. So then I started programming in C, which was an awful choice. I don't recommend it. For a 12-year-old mind to grasp what pointers are, I just remember it's very,
12-year-old Malik and free doesn't go well.
That's right. So, throughout my teens, I sort of like learned how to program better. And I actually started a consulting company when I was still in high school this is back when this World Wide Web thing was starting to come on the scene. And so I sort of helped small businesses get to the internet, sort of e-commerce, ify their businesses, both the back end and the front end. And honestly, that was a great experience for, I look back on that. I learned how to interface with customers, how to do a little bit of sales, a little bit of customer support, kind of do everything. But I eventually decided, hey, I want to get into a real job. So I went and worked at EMC for a few years. I grew up around the Boston area, and they were kind of the big company back then. And so that was a great experience. It was very IBM sort of like culture back then. So I saw a different side of enterprise computing. And then eventually, I sort of fell in love with Java and then .NET, and that led me to Microsoft.
Nice. Did you ever wind up writing a game?
Sometimes I go back to it. I'm not nearly as creative as I used to be when I was a kid. And unfortunately, I've lost all of my hard drives from the games I did write back then.
That is a shame, but it is a good story. I like it. Yeah. Hey, Pete, that was the end of my questions. I want to give you a chance. Is there anything else you wanted to ask?
I guess I just wanted to follow up with, obviously you can go to www.pulumi.com to find out more. Is there an event that you guys are having that you're going to be at soon, or a webinar or something like that you'd like to promote as we part here?
Yeah, for sure. So if you're in Seattle, we have a new meetup. We're starting a user group. We just moved into new digs downtown. So we're going to be doing another one in April. You can look on Meetup to find out about that. We will be at GlueCon. We're sponsoring GlueCon. We're sponsoring KubeCon. I think this year, we raised our Series A in October. And so we've got a bit more funds to actually get out there. So we're going to be trying to make the rounds at all the relevant conferences. So definitely looking forward to it. Follow us on Twitter. Always happy to chat with anyone. We have a community Slack also that's super vibrant. It's great to see the community helping the community, and it's really growing and exploding.
Yeah.
So feel free to join that too.
GlueCon is always awesome. That should be required. Every developer needs to go at least once.
Yeah.
That's an awesome conference.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for being on the show, for explaining what Pulumi's about, for tolerating our crazy questions, especially the questions about llamas.
Anytime. It was a lot of fun.
We greatly enjoyed talking with you and learning about your company. So thanks so much. And we hope you'll come back soon and share with us progress as things move along.
Awesome. Thank you both.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye, Pete.